At some point, you realize something uncomfortable. The drawings that you spent weeks putting together are not being followed the way you expected. They're being adjusted, or they're being questioned, or they're being worked around, and nobody treats it like something's wrong. You'll notice in small ways first. A contractor will ask a question that feels like it should not need to be asked. A detail gets built just a little bit differently than you drew it. Or a consultant sends something back that doesn't match what you coordinated. And then you stop because your first instinct is to think something broke. Maybe the set wasn't clear enough. Maybe coordination slipped. Maybe you missed something. So you go back and check. And the uncomfortable part is the drawings are actually pretty clear. They say what you thought they said, and still the project starts drifting slightly away from them. Not dramatically, not in a way that sets off any alarms, but just enough that you'll start noticing a gap between what you drew and what's actually happened, the design intent versus the execution. And here's the part that really throws people off. Nobody seems surprised. No one's rushing to fix it. No one's acting like the drawings were violated. No one's treating it like a failure. They just adjust, they keep moving, and they make the next decision. If you're paying attention, that's the moment something shifts. Because up until then, you thought drawings were instructions, and now you're watching them get interpreted in real time. That's a different profession than the one most people think that they entered. You're listening to The Practice of Practice, a podcast for architects, designers, and emerging professionals navigating the gap between school and real work. We focus on the realities most people only learn through experience: workflow, judgment, responsibility, and time. It's not theory, it's practice. Early on, you don't really question it. You're given a task, you produce a set, you coordinate what you see, and then you issue drawings. There's a clean cause and effect to it. You draw it, and it gets built. Or at least that's how it feels. And honestly, for a little while, that assumption holds up just long enough to reinforce itself. You're working on smaller scopes, fewer moving parts. You have more direct oversight, and you have tighter boundaries. The things feel contained. So you build an assumption without realizing it. If the drawings are clear, the project should follow them. That's the baseline. Clarity equals control. And then you get a little further in. A few more projects, a little more authority, a little more autonomy, and a little less hand-holding. That's when the cracks start showing up. Not all at once, just in small moments. A contractor pushes back on something that seemed pretty straightforward. Hey, we're thinking of doing it this way instead. A consultant shifts something that you thought was already aligned. Based on our layout, we moved this slightly. A field condition shows up that forces a change. Listen, this isn't going to fit the way it's drawn. Now, individually, none of those moments feel like they're dramatic. They all sound pretty reasonable, and they have logic behind them. They seem like they're manageable. So you just adjust, you revise, and you keep moving. But if you zoom out for a second, something else is happening. The drawings aren't being followed any longer. They're being negotiated constantly by people with their own constraints, priorities, risks, and pressures. Nobody announces that. There's no meeting where someone says, just so everyone knows, from this point forward, the drawings are just more of a position than the final answer. You start noticing it. Your details aren't wrong. They're just not final. Your layouts are not incorrect. They're just not in control. That's where that disconnection starts, because you're still operating under the assumption that the drawings are the authority. So every adjustment feels like a deviation. Every change feels like slippage. Every interpretation feels like something is starting to break down. But it's not breaking. It is doing what it was always going to do. You're just seeing it clearly for the first time. And that realization usually doesn't feel clean. It feels more frustrating because it forces a question you were not expecting. If the drawings are not fixed, then what actually is? This is where most people go wrong. Not in the drawings, in how they interpret what's happening. Because once you start seeing those adjustments, your instinct is to diagnose them like a problem. You think, they're not following my drawings. or something's broken coordination and we need to tighten this up. And that reaction makes sense. You were trained to think that way. In school, the drawing is the answer. It's the final output. It's what gets reviewed and judged and approved. So when something doesn't match the drawing, the assumption is simple. Something went wrong. That mindset doesn't disappear when you start working. It just follows you into practice. So now you're watching things shift and your brain is still applying the same logic. Mismatch equals mistake, or deviation equals failure. But here's the part that takes a minute to accept. Nothing is actually breaking. This is just how it actually works. The contractor is not ignoring you, or the consultant or the engineer is not being careless, and the project's not falling apart. You're just realizing you never fully understand what drawings were doing, because drawings were never meant to be final instructions. They're always part of a process that continues after they're issued. And that process includes interpretation, adjustment, negotiation, constraint, pressure, and compromise. You're just not exposed to that part yet. So instead of recognizing the system, you question the execution. You tighten your drawings, you try to be more precise, and you add more notes. And then you double check coordination. You try to close every gap. Those are all good instincts, but they don't fix what you think they're fixing, because the issue isn't clarity, it's expectation. You expected control, but what you're seeing is movement. And those aren't the same thing. This is why your frustration will start to build, because now you're doing what you think good practice looks like. You're being careful, you're being thorough, and you're trying to eliminate ambiguity. And things still move. Still, we have decisions that shift, or interpretations happening, or still someone's in the field changing something that looked settled on paper. So eventually the question starts showing up. What's the point of getting this exactly right if it's just going to change anyway? And that is a real question. Most people don't say it out loud, but they feel it. And if you don't reframe what drawings actually are, that question turns into one of two bad habits. You either overreact and overcorrect and try to control everything, or you pull back and assume none of it even matters. Neither one of those help, because both are built on the same misread, that the drawings are supposed to lock the project in place. They do not, and they never did. Once you stop expecting that from them, something else becomes visible. The project is not ignoring the drawings, it's interacting with them, responding to them, testing them, pushing them, and in some cases, refining them. And that interaction, that's where a lot of the real work actually happens. Not in the production, but in the response. So the shift is not, how do I make better drawings so nothing changes? The shift is, what actually happens after the drawings leave my desk? Because that's where the profession actually lives. So if drawings are not instructions, what are they? They're more of a position. They're your best coordinated understanding of the project at that specific moment in time. And that's really it. It's not a final answer. It's not a frozen condition. And it's not a permanent truth. It's a position. And the second those drawings leave your desk, they enter a system. A real one. Not the clean and controlled environment you had while you were building the set. And this is especially in renovation projects. But a system that includes contractors thinking about sequencing and means and methods, and consultants managing their own priorities and blind spots that they have, owners reacting to cost, schedule, politics within their systems, or field conditions that don't match the assumptions, timing, pressure that forces decisions before anyone feels ready. That system does not simply execute drawings. It reshapes them constantly, sometimes in small ways. A dimension shifts, a material changes, a routing gets adjusted, or a clearance gets rethought. But sometimes it can be in bigger ways. A whole assembly might get simplified, or a detail gets revised based on an existing condition. Scope might get reduced to save some cost here. Or a sequence of construction changes and the design has to absorb it a bit. These changes are not random, they're responses, responses to cost, almost most importantly, responses to constructability and responses to field reality. There are also responses to timing, responses to risk. So when you see something getting adjusted, it's not automatically a breakdown, it's a signal. Something in the system is pushing back. And that pushback is where the negotiation happens. Because this is what drawings really are. They're not final instructions, they're an opening position in an ongoing negotiation between intent and reality, between design intent and cost, between design intent and constructability, between coordination and field conditions, between speed and precision, between risk and decision making. And negotiation doesn't happen all at once. It just happens over and over again through RFIs, through submittal and submittal reviews, through consultant feedback, through field conversations, and through quick calls made under pressure. We also see it through details that look clean on paper but get messy the second they actually hit real conditions. That's the life cycle of a drawing for real. Not a draw, issue, build cycle. It's more like draw, issue, interpret, adjust, confirm, and then adjust again. If you're not expecting that, it feels chaotic. It feels like things are slipping. It feels like people are eroding the work. But once you understand it, it starts to feel different. It starts to feel more like movement, which is actually what it is. Because a project is not a static object, it's a moving system, and drawings are one part of how that system communicates. Important? Yes. Controlling? Not so much. They carry intent, they frame decisions, they help align people, and they establish a direction. But they do not freeze reality in place. And this is where that shift starts to get a little bit uncomfortable. Because if the drawings are just a position, the control is not coming from the drawings. And that's what usually people don't realize until they have a few projects under their belt. They think the authority lives in the set that they created, but the set is not what keeps the project aligned. The set enters the project, and then the project starts pushing back. And once that happens, the question is no longer whether the drawings were clear. The question is whether the intent survives the pressure. It's a different standard. A more useful one too, really, because now you're not asking, why did this change? You're asking, what is changing? Why is it changing? And is the core intent still holding? And that's really a much more senior question. And it's where this episode starts turning into the next one. Because once drawings are no longer what holds the project together, something else has to. And that's something, it's not a line weight or a keynote or a cleaner detail call out. It's people. People noticing movement. People protecting intent. People making decisions. People holding the line when it matters. That's where responsibility starts entering the picture. This is where frustration comes in. Not from the changes themselves, but from the expectation that they weren't supposed to change. Because when you think drawings or instructions, every adjustment feels like a problem. When you see something shift, your first reaction is, why is this changing? Something got missed, or something got overlooked, or something needs to be corrected. But once you understand drawings as a part of negotiation, the question changes. Now it becomes, why is this being pushed on? And that's a much better question, because the friction you feel is not coming from the project. It's coming from the gap between what you expected and what's actually happening. You expected control, but you're seeing movement. And movement feels messy when you thought the important decisions were already over. This is the part that gets under people's skin. You spend time getting something right. You spend time coordinating it. You spend time thinking it through. Then you clean it up, and then you issue it. And then it just changes anyway. And it feels like your effort didn't hold, like it didn't stick. And that feeling is real. Nobody likes doing something carefully just to watch it change. But the change isn't invalidating the work. It's allowing it to continue. And it takes a while to let that settle in. The project didn't leave your work behind. It just carried it forward into a system that keeps testing it. And yeah, this is usually where people start getting really annoyed because continuing the work sounds noble until it's your detail getting rethought in the field. But the reframe still matters. The frustration shouldn't be, this should not have changed. It is, I thought this was already settled. And that's a different problem. Once you see that clearly, the tension drops a bit. Not because the work gets easier, because it starts making more sense to you. You stop fighting the movement. You start paying attention to it. Because that movement is where the real decisions are being made. Not in the static version of the drawings, in how they evolve afterward. Once you see this, your role starts to change. It's not a title change, not an announcement. No one sits you down and says, hey, congratulations, you now understand how the work actually behaves. It just shifts. You move from asking, did I draw this correctly? To asking, what's going to happen after I draw this? And that's a different mindset. Because now you're not just focused on producing something clean. You're paying attention to how it holds up, how it gets interpreted, how it might get adjusted, where it gets pushed, where intent starts to thin out, and where small compromises start adding up. And then this is where responsibility starts showing up. Because if drawings are not fixed, then someone has to pay attention to how they move. Someone has to notice when something shifts too far, when intent gets diluted, when decisions start drifting, or when the logic still sounds reasonable but the project is losing its direction. Drawings don't do that by themselves. People do. And this is a part most people don't see coming. You think that getting better means producing cleaner work. It does to a point, but after a few projects, that's not really the differentiator anymore. What is awareness. Seeing what's happening after the work leaves your hands. Not just whether the drawing is correct, whether the project is still coherent as it keeps moving. That awareness changes how you show up. You start to ask different questions. You notice different moments, and you listen differently in meetings. You just stop assuming that clarity on paper equals control in reality. Because now you know better. You've seen the gap. And once you see it, you can't really go back. That's the shift. Not from drawing to management, but from production to judgment. And then that leads straight to the next question. If the drawings aren't what hold the project together, what is? So what do you actually do with this? Not tactically, mentally. Because it's not something that you fix once. It's something that you start seeing correctly. First, stop expecting the drawings to hold everything in place. That expectation just creates a lot of unnecessary friction and stress, and we all have enough stress. If you assume things will move, then when they do, it's not automatically alarming. It's just part of the process. Second, pay attention to how things change. Not just what changed, why? What triggered it? Was it cost or constructability? Was it a field reality? Was it timing? Was it a coordination miss? Was it a decision that took too long to get a response from? Because those moments will tell you more about how projects actually worked than the drawing set ever will. And third, stop measuring success as, did this get built exactly how it was drawn? That's not even a real metric. A better question is, did my intent survive the process? Because things will change. They always do. The goal is not to freeze the project. It's to keep it aligned as it moves. And if you're going to keep something in your head, let it be this. If everything is going exactly how it was drawn, something's probably being missed. Not because the drawings were wrong, but because nothing important has pushed on them yet. And that pressure is where problems gets exposed. It's also where the decisions get better. So instead of resisting that part of the process, expect it, watch for it, learn from it. And once you do that, the work just starts to feel different. Less like you're trying to control everything and more like you're paying attention to what actually matters. Let's pull this episode together. At some point, every architect runs into this. You put a set of drawings together, you coordinate it, you issue it, and then you watch it get adjusted in ways you did not expect. And the first instinct is to think something's broke. Nothing is broke. You just saw the system clearly for the first time. Drawings are intent, not instructions, and they're a part of an ongoing negotiation between intent and reality, clarity and constraint, and between what you want to build and what actually gets built. That negotiation doesn't start after the drawings fail. It starts the second the drawings enter the project. So if it starts to feel like the things are shifting more than they should, it doesn't mean the work is weak. That is the work. The part most people don't see coming is what follows that realization. Because once drawings are not fixed, control does not come from the drawings. Drawings don't control projects. People do. Someone has to notice what's moving. Someone has to decide what matters. Someone has to protect what needs to hold and what can flex. That's where responsibility starts to show up. Not as a title, as a function. And once you see that, the real question becomes, who is actually responsible when those negotiations happen? And that's where we're going to go next. The practice of architecture is not intuitive, but it is learnable. So we'll keep building from here. This podcast only works if it gets passed along. Not because of me, but because the hardest parts of practice are usually learned in isolation. If this episode put words to something that you've been struggling with, share it with someone earlier in practice, or leave a comment naming the moment that hit. I'm doing this because I remember how long it took to realize that I wasn't behind. I just wasn't being taught. Most of what feels like a personal failure in this profession is actually a shared pattern. The more we name those patterns, the faster we all get better. I'll see you in the next one.